My name is Carolyn Wheeler with the ASCD website team. Welcome to Strength-Based Strategies for Students with Special Needs with Thomas Armstrong. And now a brief introduction to our presenter. Thomas Armstrong is the Executive Director of the American Institute for Learning and Human Development and has been an educator for the past 40 years. He has worked for several years as a special education teacher in the United States and Canada, developed courses in human development for colleges and universities in the San Francisco Bay Area, and served as an educational consultant for schools in New York State. For the past 27 years, he has been an author, keynote speaker, and workshop leader in 43 states and 18 countries. ASCD is pleased to welcome Thomas Armstrong. And before Thomas takes over, he wanted me to give some poll questions to our audience just so he can get a gauge of where everybody is. So right now you should be seeing the poll on your screen, and we do have answers coming in. And it looks like most folks are elementary school. I'll give you a couple of more seconds to respond. Thomas, I don't know if you can see the numbers coming in.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I'm going to close it, and I'm going to share the results with the audience. So you should be seeing that on your screen right now. So it looks like 45% are elementary school, 27% middle school, 24% high school, and 2% for both post-secondary and early childhood. I'm going to go ahead and launch the next poll, which is, are you familiar with the concept of neurodiversity, which is the subject of Thomas's latest book from ASCD. I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds. Okay, so it looks like, most everybody is not familiar with the concept of neurodiversity. So hopefully you'll be able to get something out of this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenter. To tell you all you need to know about neurodiversity.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, for that introduction, and welcome to this webinar. And basically in this webinar, I'd like to give you 2 things. First, I'd like to give you a fundamental reorientation in the way that we view students with special needs. And secondly, I'd like to give you a lot of practical strategies that are based upon that fundamental and more positive reorientation. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is tell you a little story, and I'd like you to imagine that magically overnight the world had been transformed into a culture of flowers. Some of us are petunias, some of us are tulips, some of us are daisies, and so forth. And I'd like you to imagine that in this culture of flowers, the psychiatrists are the roses. And so imagine one day in the life of a psychiatrist, Rose, and his first patient comes in, and it happens to be a sunflower. And the sunflower comes in, and the psychiatrist, Rose, begins to examine it carefully. And after a period of time, he comes to his diagnosis. He says to the sunflower, I'm afraid that you have hugism. This is preventable if we catch it early enough, but I'm afraid in your case we didn't do that, so I'm afraid you're going to have to learn to live with your disorder. So the sunflower left with its head drooping. And then the next patient that came in was a tiny bluet. And the Rose psychiatrist spent a little bit of time examining the bluet and finally said, my diagnosis is you have a growing disability. We believe it's a genetic condition. But with appropriate treatment, you can learn to live a successful and productive life somewhere in a plot of sandy loam. Well, the bluet left the office feeling even smaller than when it came in. The next patient to come in was a calla lily. And it didn't take the Rose psychiatrist very long to come to a conclusion. And he said, it's obvious to me what your diagnosis is. You have pedal deficit disorder. And you see in each of these cases, the Rose psychiatrist saw each of these patients as coming up short because they didn't look like the Rose psychiatrist. They didn't look like the norm, whatever that norm was supposed to be. And it's struck me that when we look at flowers, for example, we honor diversity. When we look at nature, when we look at the coral reef, for example, we love biodiversity. We see it as important. In fact, we're trying to protect the biodiversity in the world. Same thing with cultural diversity. We honor the variety of cultures that exist around the world and the contributions they make to human potential. But the funny thing is, when it comes to the differences in human brains, it seems like that we have gone back not to a diversity model, but to a disability model. The Rose psychiatrist, in fact, has for the last 60 years used the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and you see here in this slide 5 different versions of it because it comes out in a revised version every few years. Now look at the top volume, how thin it is. Actually, when the very first DSM came out, there was about 100 disorders listed. And the latest version has over 300 disorders. So we've tripled the number of psychiatric disorders in the last 60 years. We've multiplied. What I've suggested, in fact, is that we become a culture of disabilities. And this is no more true than in special education. I was a special education teacher for many years in Canada, in the United States, and I discovered that a lot of the human potential and human growth and positive psychology materials that I'd been studying up to that point were not being addressed in special education. The special education was focused on deficit and disability. Well, after my time as a special ed teacher, I focused a lot of attention on multiple intelligences, as some of you know. And the theory of multiple intelligences, Howard Gardner's model, gave me a perspective on viewing kids that I had worked with in my special education classrooms and gave a more positive perspective. I was able to see their gifts. And so this was a great model. And yet these labels still remain disability labels. And so I was still frustrated with how to go about reconceptualizing the field of special education. Well, several years ago, I was on the internet and I ran into a website called neurodiversity.com. And it had these pictures of various artists and creative eccentrics and so forth. And at the bottom, it said, honoring the variety of human wiring. And I had one of those aha experiences. And I said, that's what we need to talk about when we talk about kids in special ed. Not about disability, dysfunction, and deficits, but about diversity. And so the whole concept of neurodiversity began to make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, what is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is an idea that asserts that atypical or neurodivergent neurological development is a normal human difference that is to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. So just as we honor cultural diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation diversity, and so on, so too we should honor the diversity of ways in which people learn, the diversity of ways in which people attend, the ways in which people are sociable or not so sociable, the diversity of brains, essentially. So what I'd like to do now is give you some basic principles of neurodiversity that can help us reorient ourselves in respect to the field of special education. The first thing, or first principle of neurodiversity, is that we've got to change the way that we think about the brain. Up till now, the way we've been thinking about the brain has been more or less in terms of a machine or a computer. But in fact, the brain is an ecosystem. The brain is a rainforest. The brain is wetware. It's not software. And if we look at nature, for example, and we look at, for example, lightning, we see an analogy in the brain in the way that neurons fire and transfer and convey information from one brain cell to the next. If we look at the ebb and flow of the tides of the oceans, we see an analogy in the way in which neurotransmitters are sent across the synaptic cleft into the next brain cell and then taken back up into the originating axon. So we see that kind of analogy. When we look at nature and see the ways in which nature can rejuvenate itself, even in the face of destruction, we see an analogy in the way that the brain can heal itself. There's a wonderful book by Norman Doidge called The Brain That Changes Itself, which has many wonderful case histories of individuals with brain injuries of different types who, through education, through technology, through other innovative approaches, have been able to overcome those problems and learn effectively. So the brain has this incredible plasticity that mimics what exists in nature. Finally, in terms of the brain as rainforest, I borrow that metaphor not from literature. I borrow it actually from science. This man here, Gerald Edelman, who won the Nobel Prize several years ago, basically said the brain is a rainforest. He believed that the brain is a Darwinian struggle. He wrote a book called Neural Darwinism, and he believed that brain cells compete against each other for supremacy in terms of which neurons are going to be wired and which ones are going to be fired and which ones are going to deteriorate. And so he used this kind of rainforest analogy, and it means that we need to start thinking not so much in terms of computer languages and mechanisms as much as we need to talk about the ecology of the brain and the ecology of brain differences. The second principle relates to social issues, and it suggests that social values oftentimes, in fact usually, dictate the disorders that a society determines exist in that culture. And I'll give you a couple examples. Back in the 1850s, a man in Louisiana named Samuel Cartwright, a physician, wrote an article in the New Orleans Medical Journal saying that he discovered a new metaphor called drapetomania. And basically, drapeto means to flee, and mania means an obsession with. So drapetomania meant an obsession with fleeing. If the drapetomania afflicted large numbers of runaway slaves, and that with appropriate identification and treatment, they could learn to live a successful and productive life back on the plantation. Now we look at this and we see an example of blatant racism, but back then it was considered scientific. It was considered a scientific disorder. As recently as the 1920s and the 1930s, if you scored at a certain level on an IQ test, you were officially diagnosed by a psychiatrist as a moron. That was a scientific term. If you scored a little bit worse than that, you'd be classified as an imbecile, and if you scored even lower, you would be diagnosed as an idiot. These are now obviously insults, but at one time they were scientific terms that were considered, certainly very proper and appropriate. So we see that cultural values change, and as they change, old disorders become obsolete or racist, and new disorders emerge. Even in today's culture, if you're growing up among the Puluwat culture in the South Sea Islands, they live on 500 different islands, and the ability to navigate has high cultural value. If you had the ability to navigate, if you had high spatial intelligence, you would be the gifted one in that particular culture. Whereas if you were like me and can't find your car in a large shopping mall, you would end up being disabled in that society. And so whether or not you're going to be labeled as gifted or disabled may have more to do with when and where you're born than anything intrinsic to yourself as an individual. And we've got to keep that in mind when we use these labels like learning disabled and ADHD and so forth with our students. Some of our kids who we label as ADHD in this culture, who have incredible abilities, as we'll see in a few minutes, would be the gifted ones in other cultures. Okay, principle 3 raises the issue, okay, it's true what you say about social values changing, but we don't live in a different culture. We don't live in the South Sea Islands. We don't live back in the 1920s. We live in the world today, which is a complex world, which requires a lot of complex neurological functioning and so forth. And so we need to help our kids adapt to the environment that exists now, not the one that existed 100 years ago. And I would agree with that. I would say that I call that the first kind of success is to help adapt to the environment that is around them. And of course, there is a precedent for this in our scientific literature. In fact, this is Darwin's theory of natural selection, whereby through random mutations, organisms have traits, acquired traits, that work for the particular environment that they're in, so they thrive, they survive, they pass their genes on. And you know, the analogy in the classroom is that we've got to help our kids adapt to the classrooms and the modern culture, the 21st century learning project that is out there for them to learn. So helping them adapt is important. But the other part of success is the reverse of that, and it basically means not making them adapt to the environment, but making the environment adapt to them. I think you've got to do both of these things. You need to help kids adapt to what's around them, but you also need to change what's around them to meet who they are. And I call that constructing positive niches. There's actually, you know, this is part of the scientific literature as well. A recent book called Niche Construction, The Neglected Process in Evolution, suggests that niche construction may be as important as natural selection in the survival of species. Now, what is niche construction? Well, very simply, this is what animals do all the time in the wild. Beavers build dams. They alter the environment around them to meet their particular needs and the way in which they, you might say, process information, or in the way in which they behave. Spiders spin webs. Birds build nests. Bees create hives. And in each of these cases, the environment is being modified to come to the needs of the particular organism that's involved. Well, we need to do the same thing in the classroom. We need to alter the environment for a lot of these kids with special needs to meet their particular ways of learning and growing and behaving. Yes, it's true we've got to help them adapt, but we also need to honor who they are and create learning environments that will allow them to be who they are. So basically what I'd like to talk about is, for the rest of this workshop, is positive niche construction and how we can go about doing it. I want to first point out, however, that positive niches, we know from science, actually modifies the brain directly. We know this from experiments that began in the 1960s, where rats were put in different kinds of cages and basically different niches. At the bottom of the slide, you see rats in an enriched environment. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a rat in an isolated environment, what I'd call an impoverished environment. And then in the upper left, you see a standard laboratory cage. Well, in this particular experiment protocol, after the period of about 90 days, they dissected the brains of these rats, and what they discovered is that the brain cells and the dendrites of the rats in an enriched cage were actually thicker and more complex than the brain cells of rats in an isolated cage. And so what we began to realize is that enriched environments literally create new brain connections between brain cells. And then in the 1990s, we discovered something even more compelling, and that was that enriched environments can even grow new brain cells, which we never thought was possible before. So positive niche construction has a good neurological, neurobiological basis, both in the understanding of evolution and in the understanding of the construction of environments in laboratory environments. Okay, so the rest of this workshop is going to look at strategies. It's going to look at 7 basic components that you can use to organize the way in which you create positive environments or positive niches for your students with special needs. The first way or first component of positive niche construction is strength awareness. More than anything else, we need to be aware of our students' strengths. And this is the problem that I ran into in special education, was that it seemed, that the focus was on what they were having trouble with. But it seemed to me that if someone was having trouble with something, they needed to be surrounded by adults who saw the best in them, not who were focusing on the things that they were having the most difficulty with. And so the first and most important component of positive niche construction is finding out as much as you can about the strengths, talents, and abilities of your students with special needs, whether you're working in the special education classroom or in an inclusion classroom. Now, there is a legal mandate for this. In the IDEA 2004 Act, it states very clearly that in developing each child's IEP, the IEP team shall consider the strengths of the child. So this is something we need to do. Unfortunately, what happens is this is often given lip service, and a few things are thrown in the IEP like, tries hard, has a happy personality or something like that. We need to be much more rigorous in the way in which we approach the strengths of these kids. And what I want to do now is talk with you about what we've discovered in the past few years about some of the strengths of kids with some of these different neurological issues. First of all, let's talk about autism spectrum disorder. One of the things we've discovered is that people with autism oftentimes are incredibly good at working with small details. If you look at the slide on the right side of this slide, the screen, you will see a triangle at the top and a baby buggy at the bottom. This task is called the embedded figures task, and the task is to essentially find that triangle shape somewhere in this more complex drawing of the baby buggy. And it turns out that people with autism do better at this embedded figures task than the so-called normal or typically developing person. They also do better at the block design task on the left, where you take a pattern and you have to decide which folded up cube would be represented by that original pattern. They also do better than the typically developing person on that. They also do very well on IQ tests that involve spatial, highly abstract processing. In fact, they've discovered that if you give an autistic person the Raven's Progressive Matrices IQ test, they score 30 to 70% higher than if you give them an IQ test that is more conventional, like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. Simply using this IQ test can change our image of who these kids are intellectually. Another very interesting theory that's been proposed by a man named Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge University in England is that individuals with autism are really good systemizers and really poor empathizers. He's, in his model, created a continuum where he talks about, on one end, the empathizers, who are frequently female, and on the other end, the systemizers, who are very frequently male. Now, systemizers are into machines, they're into computer programs, they're into football games, they're into languages, they're into mathematics, and it can be, as complex as a, higher mathematical system, or as rudimentary for a so-called low-functioning autistic child as a whirring fan that they like to sit in front of and stare at for hours at a time. But the fact is, they work well with systems, and so we should be focusing on that and not spending all of our time bewailing the fact that they have difficulty with empathy. Certainly we have to help them adapt to the surrounding environment and become sociable. But if we get hung up on that as our total purpose, we lose sight of the fact that they possess this other gift which deserves developing and using in the curriculum. Learning disabilities. One of the things that a recent study suggested was that people who are dyslexic actually can more quickly and effectively look at a picture like this and decide whether the object displayed is an impossible figure to build or a possible figure to build. Now, if you look closely, it looks like, now I'm giving the right answer here, this is impossible to build. Someone with dyslexia can tell that more quickly than a typically developing person. And in fact, people with dyslexia and learning disabilities often have high visual spatial intelligence of a third dimension quality. They have 3D minds. This is actually a document from my doctoral dissertation many years ago. I did my dissertation on the strengths of children who've been labeled learning disabled. And I discovered, in fact, that a lot of them had these 3D minds. This middle school student created this picture as if you were looking at a car from up above. This is the mind of the architect. This is the mind of the graphic designer. We ought to be appreciating these strengths and not simply focusing on remediating their deficits. For the ADD, ADHD diagnosed child, one of the things that's been looked at is that from an evolutionary point of view, it seems that ADHD was actually an advantage. Back in the days of hunting, in fact, the hunter needed to be able to move quickly, and that's hyperactivity. They needed to be able to pay attention to a number of stimuli around them because, you know, it could be food, it could be something that wants to have them for food. So distractibility, if you want to call it that, was an evolutionary advantage. Also, they had to respond quickly to any stimulus. And so impulsivity was an advantage as well. So we need to recognize that there's probably a reason why these genes are still in the gene pool, that they served an advantage in our development in prehistory. The fact is, though, we still need these kinds of skills and abilities, as we'll see when we talk a little bit later about career and career aspirations. But I just want to also point out a woman named Bonnie Cramond at the University of Georgia looked at the warning signs of ADHD, and then she looked at the traits of the creative person, and she realized that they were very much the same thing. You know, for the ADHD person, we talk about them having impulsivity. Well, the creative person, that's called spontaneity. For the ADHD person, we talk about distractibility. Well, for the creative person, that's the divergent mind. So it's the same thing. It's just in one context we regard it as a negative. In another context, we regard it as a positive. And there's compelling evidence to suggest that many of these kids that we label ADHD are in fact creative individuals. They're novelty-seeking people. They like new things. They get bored with the same old thing over and over again. And is that such a bad thing? Finally, I want to talk about brain development in kids with ADHD. It turns out that many kids, in fact, most kids with ADHD have normal brain development, but their brain matures 3 years later than the typically developing individual. There's a name for this, and it's called neoteny. Neoteny means holding youth. It means the characteristics of childhood are held as one grows into adulthood. You know, you stay young longer, essentially, is what it means. This illustration here shows that you see this baby chimp with very human-like characteristics which are lost when that chimp grows into adulthood. So there is no neoteny. Those traits are not held into adulthood. But then you look at Phil Donahue as a child and as an adult, and you see that his forehead and his chin pretty much stay the same shape. So there is neoteny in his case. Now, those are physical characteristics, but we can also talk about psychological characteristics. And in fact, kids with ADHD tend to be more playful, they tend to be more spontaneous, they tend to be more imaginative, and they have a lot of these traits of childhood that we need to maintain and preserve into adulthood. So these things ought to be shepherded and channeled in healthy directions rather than seen as deficits that need to be somehow medicated out of existence. Intellectual disabilities. One of the things that we've discovered when we talk about intellectual disabilities is we have to revise our notion of intelligence. And of course, Howard Gardner comes to the rescue here with his theory of multiple intelligences. And what we discover is that while many people with intellectual disabilities like Down syndrome have difficulty with logical, mathematical, and linguistic, and some of the other intelligences, they flourish many times in the personal intelligences. They have dramatic abilities. This individual, Pablo Pineda, won the Best Actor Award for a play, or actually a movie in Spain, where he portrayed an individual with Down syndrome who graduated from college, which was basically based on his life because he graduated from college as well. This is another great example. Gloria Lenhoff has something called Williams syndrome, which affects 1 in every 9,000 people. And Gloria can sing opera in 26 different languages, including Chinese. Now, people with Williams syndrome aren't necessarily, singing opera in 26 different languages, but the research suggests that people with Williams syndrome, on average, have higher musical aptitude and capability than the typically developing person. So again, we see elements of strength in some of these other intelligences in Gardner's model that are not effectively assessed in standard IQ testing formats. Emotional behavioral disorders. One of the things that we have began to understand through the work of people like psychiatrist Kay Redfield Jamison is that individuals with emotional disorders often have creativity. You look at authors, you look at artists, people in entertainment, high percentages of these individuals have had various kinds of disorders, including bipolar disorder, depression, unipolar disorder, and even schizophrenia. A recent, well, actually 2005 studies at Stanford looked at the creative test results of children with bipolar disorder compared to children who are typically developing, and they found that the children with bipolar disorder scored higher on this creativity test. So again, we're seeing elements of strength. Now, in my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, I've got a 156-item neurodiversity strengths checklist. What I've tried to be as comprehensive as I possibly can about looking at all the strengths that are out there so that when we look at a child with a special need, we can go through this 156-item list and find strengths related to them. Because one of the things oftentimes I find with parents or with teachers, they'll say, he doesn't have any strengths. Because all they see is the problems. All they see is the behavior disorder or the poor reading or whatever happens to be. Well, this 156-item checklist suggests that in order for you to be able to say that, you have to go through each of these items and not check anything in order for you to make that statement. And my claim is that, or my belief is that people just haven't looked hard enough who say that kind of thing, that we really need to be good strength detectives, essentially, in our work helping kids with special needs. The second component of positive niche construction is we need to give these kids positive role models of individuals who, like themselves, struggled with disability labels and yet, in some sense, managed to minimize the difficulties they had and maximize their strengths and abilities to make themselves successful in the world. So we ought to be telling them, in terms of autism, about Temple Grandin, who many of you have heard about through the HBO movie of her life. She's actually developed 1/3 of the animal machinery used in the United States to shunt cattle and other animals around in the stockyards. And she is diagnosed with autism. With learning disabilities, we have the example of Carol Breiter, who is dyslexic and who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology in 2009 for her research on telomeres, which are the ends of chromosomes that get shorter and shorter as we age. In ADD, ADHD, we have the example of Michael Phelps, for example. And these are just, one example of each, but there are many, many examples for each of these that can be given to inspire our kids. With intellectual disabilities, Chris Burke, who had that major role playing a person with Down syndrome, which he has in the TV series Life Goes On back in the 1980s. And he continues to act. He performs in a musical group. He's an advocate for Down syndrome around the world. He edits a newsletter. He's very highly active and a wonderful role model for people with intellectual disabilities. With emotional and behavioral disorders, well, we could just look at most of the entertainment industry, but I'll just stay with Robert Downey Jr., who has struggled with substance abuse and bipolar disorder and managed to turn his life around, actually, after a lot of struggle and a lot of backsliding. And so he would make a good role model. These role models are essentially saying, to the kids with special needs, if these people can do it, so can I. because it turns out that special ed kids can really do amazing things. You see 6 kids here, starting at the top left-hand row. That person had dyslexia. Then going to the right, the next person had speech difficulties and conduct disorder. The next person had language delays. Now going to the bottom row, starting from the left, this person had sensory deficits, severe sensory deficits. The next person had learning disabilities, and the final person had ADHD. Well, who were these people? Well, special ed kids have changed the world, because we're talking about Agatha Christie, Winston Churchill, Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, Henry Ford, and Thomas Edison. So we really ought to be creating curriculum units that talk about people with these disability labels, but in terms of their positive contributions and in terms of how their diversity has added to our culture. The next component is assistive technologies and universal design for learning methodologies. There's so much that's happened, even in the last 5 to 10 years, that has made it possible for kids with special needs to accomplish things that could have been or would have been impossible for them to do, or made it very difficult for them to do before the advent of these technologies. And I'll just give you one example for each of these disability categories. Autistic spectrum disorder, we've got the program Stories to Learn, where parents or teachers helping the kids can put together slideshows with an audio background, which basically show them how to do simple, basic social acts, like engaging in reciprocal play, like how to take turns when you're playing a game, like interpreting gestures. So this is a program that can really teach kids specific social skills to help them adapt to the environment around them. For learning disabilities, Dragon Naturally Speaking makes use of the strengths of many of these kids who are dyslexic, learning disabled, who have strong oral language, but problems putting their ideas down by typing them or writing them. So they can speak them into the computer and have that transformed into text. And this makes their text production, their writing, much more fluid, much more productive than it might otherwise. And it is a universal design for learning methodology, because it not only helps kids with dyslexia and learning disabilities, but it helps all kids learn as well to become more fluent in their writing process. For ADD, ADHD, we've got programs like iStudies, which is a organizational planner software or app where they can keep track of their assignments, they can look at their grades, they can create deadlines for themselves, and in other ways manage their schoolwork effectively. And this program is particularly good for kids at the high school level. For intellectual disabilities, particularly for kids that have tremendous difficulty with communication, just basic communication, and that can include a lot of kids with autism as well, the software or app Proloquo to Go is a augmented and alternative communication device where the person touches a button and a synthesized voice will say that command for them. So this has enabled a lot of individuals who have difficulty communicating to others to open up, to get their needs met, to get their feelings expressed so that they can get on with their lives. For emotional behavioral disorders, I've suggested that a camera or a video cam are very effective technologies for dealing with, particularly with behavior disorders. My suggestion is to get a video when a person is doing something that needs to be modified and show them the video. I did this back in the 1970s when I was a special ed teacher. I took a camera shot of a student going through a tantrum, and there you have them right there. Later on, I showed him the picture in a non-judgmental way. I didn't hold the picture up and say, "Look what you did! Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" I simply said, "Oh, I thought you might be interested. This is what you look like." He never did that again because he didn't realize until he was provided with the video feedback that this was how he was coming across to the classroom. So video feedback, camera feedback can be very useful as a technology. The next component consists of strength-based learning strategies we can use to help kids with their learning and behavior and all of their issues. So for autism, for example, we know that kids with autism have often very strong interests. These are sometimes called obsessions, but that's a deficit way of looking at what is actually, I think, a very positive thing. They are very interested in, let's say, World War II insignia or the contents that were found in the Titanic, or there are very specialized interests. But if we use this interest and give the student a chance to present this interest to the class in a show and tell format, this is a way of connecting them socially and also acknowledges and values what they have to share from their own personal interests. For learning disabilities, with this three-dimensional mind that many of these kids have, having them form their letters and their phonemes in clay and even create the concepts in 3 dimensions can be a very useful approach. And in fact, just recently, actually the last few days, I discovered a very interesting technology called T-Blow, which consists of interlocking blocks that can be recorded. Each block, you can record up to 10-second message. It could be a phoneme, it could be a sight word, it could be a sequence in a story, it could even be a math problem, part of a math problem. And they lock these sequences together to create the whole word or the whole sentence or the whole story. And they can even draw pictures, so they get the visual feedback and they also get the playback, the audio feedback, and they're doing it in 3 dimensions. Wonderful program for the strengths of kids with learning disabilities. ADHD. These kids move, they learn best by moving. And so let's give them opportunities to move while they're learning. This happens to be an old slide from the Key School in Indianapolis, Indiana, and this student is crawling onto his sight words. And as he crawls to a different word, he says the word. So he's able to move and learn. How much better doing this than sitting in their seat having to memorize or repeat, in rote the meanings and the sight words of the particular lesson plan of that day. Intellectual disabilities. These are kids that do really well with mimicking, with drama, and so when we teach them something, we should do a role play of it. Do a role play of a story that has been taught. Do a role play of a historical era that's being studied. For kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, because they have this creative flair, we ought to be giving them opportunities to express their emotions creatively through the expressive arts. So when they're learning a story, they should read the story and then express their feelings about the story, or let's say if we want to be more specific, if we want to get into core common standards and talk about a main idea or some specific skill, have them express that particular skill through painting, through puppetry, through clay or sculpture, in some other creative format. The next component relates to enhancing the human resource network in which a student with special needs finds him or herself. A lot of these kids have problems because they're in bad relationships. They're having difficulties with their teacher, they're having peer conflict and so forth. So we need to look at how we can boost that human network up by either repairing the existing difficult relationships or by bringing new positive relationships into their sociogram, essentially. And so for autism, using an approach like the floor time method of Dr. Stanley Greenspan, which is a child-centered approach of communication which looks for cues from the child as a means of initiating interactions. And it's been seen as a very successful approach in the classroom. Learning disabilities, where a student can be paired with a tutor, either a peer tutor or an adult tutor, maybe a graduate student, or someone with specialized knowledge in dyslexia or learning disabilities. This can make a big difference to them, having that tutor assist them with their difficulties. For ADHD, we've got the paradigm of coaches, where the teacher or a specified coach will actually work with them on managing their time, organizing their assignments, thinking about how to go about problem solving, and so forth and so on. With intellectual disabilities, in the workforce, having a job coach, someone who can look over their work experience and help them with difficulties they run into with their colleagues and bosses and so forth, that can be an important part of their social network. And finally, emotional and behavioral disorders, counselors, psychotherapists, others who work directly with the feelings of the individual, another important part of their world. And finally, I should mention again that peer relationships are an essential part of that human resource network and ought to be looked at as well. So we ought to be using peer teaching, cross-age tutoring, cooperative learning, and other approaches that engage that. And we really ought to sit down and do a sociogram for each of these kids with special needs and diagram all the adults and children, including in and out of school, who are supporting or undermining their experience in learning, and use that map as a troubleshooting starting point for how we're going to go about enriching, enhancing their social network. The next component relates to career, and it means what we want to do through affirmative career aspirations is give our students with special needs positive images of who they could be out there in the work world, that in roles that make use of the things that are strengths for them. So for example, with autism, it turns out that a lot of kids with so-called high-functioning autism are attracted to computers. There's even a firm in Denmark that focuses on testing software programs for small detail-oriented bugs that are in the software, finding those bugs and removing them. And it turns out that 3/4 of their employees are on the autistic spectrum. And it turns out that they're in their job of their dreams because they get to do what they do well, computer programming. They get to work alone. They're told, their colleagues are told not to bug them, not to do sarcasm, not to use things that are going to confuse them. So they're really in a role that makes use of their strengths. Same thing for learning disabilities. You know, being in a role that makes use of pictures and images, like an architect, for example, would be, you know, a suitable career for an individual who has that kind of picture and image mind. For ADD, ADHD, these are individuals who have strengths in moving, in novelty seeking, in if you want to call it thrill seeking, in adrenaline rushing experiences, and firefighting can be one of those occupations. In fact, in my book I talk about an article from a firefighting newsletter where the chief said most of his firefighters have ADHD or certainly qualify for that diagnosis. Intellectual disabilities. We ought to be focusing on post-secondary education as a legitimate and viable goal for a lot of these students, because in fact there's over now 250 collegiate programs for students with intellectual disabilities. And giving them that opportunity and giving them that hope will fill them with enthusiasm and motivation to work hard while they're in school, elementary, middle, and high school. Then with emotional and behavioral disorders, it's a little more complex here, because we know that kids with that label have more difficulty than kids with any other disability label in making, taking a hold of their lives as they enter the workforce and finding stable and productive employment. So we need to work with them especially on how to plan ahead, how to think about their goals, how to go about marshaling their strengths and minimizing their weaknesses so they can gain employment in the world. And we might also suggest that self-employment may be more viable for them than working with others because of the potential of conflict, emotional conflict. And then finally, we might even suggest that being an entertainer would be a good occupation, or even a United States president. A study was done at Duke University saying that from 1850 to 1974, almost half of the U.S. presidents had some form of emotional or mental disorder. Can you believe that? The next component is positive environmental modifications. What can we do specifically with the actual environment around them? So for autistic spectrum disorder diagnosed individuals who are highly sensitive to sensory input, simply having earphones, maybe earphones that play white noise or soothing sounds, can be an environmental asset for them. For learning disabilities, having a place during the day where they can work in 3 dimensions, where they can work with art, maybe an oasis for them in an otherwise word-heavy, number-heavy kind of school situation. For ADD, ADHD, we've discovered in research that kids with ADHD actually decrease their symptoms when they're in a green environment. In other words, when they're outdoors. And the wilder the environment, the more the symptoms go away. This is a slide from Norway. I was visiting some schools in Norway, and they actually have a system that allows kids to spend one full day a week in what's called an uthus, several hundred yards from the school. And these kids actually learn about history and literature and other subjects in this outdoor environment. And that's the kind of environment that would be ideally suited to a kid with ADHD or ADD kind of labels. Finally, or penultimately, with intellectual disabilities, we ought to be providing wayfinding aids using color coding, pictures, and brightly embossed designations to help them know, which classrooms are which, where the restrooms are, how to find their way around the school environment. And then finally, for emotional behavioral disorders, we ought to be helping these kids with their self-control by giving them a space somewhere in the school or in the classroom that they can go to when they need to regain control. A kind of a chill-out center where they can relax. Not a punitive center, not a timeout center that you've done something wrong, go there and sit for 5 minutes and think about what you did. No, not that at all. More like when you're feeling angry and you feel like you want to punch somebody, that'll be the cue to know that you need to go to your chill-out center or your relaxation center or your de-stressing center or whatever you want to call it. And having this place available to them can make a difference in their lives. Just want to conclude with the words of Margaret Mead, the wonderful anthropologist who was very concerned and very honoring of cultural diversity. And she said, if we are to achieve a richer culture, rich in contrasting values, we must recognize the whole gamut of human personalities and so weave a less arbitrary social fabric, one in which each human gift will find a fitting place. Now, most of the information that I've given you today is in my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom. The principles that I discussed at the beginning of the presentation are discussed primarily in my book, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain. I'd like you to invite you to visit my website, the American Institute for Learning and Development, where you'll find more about my other books, including my books on multiple intelligences, my other books with ASCD, the kinds of presentations I do for groups, and other materials, including video clips and my blog and Twitter and social media and so forth. In your handouts, you should have a bibliography that lists some of the primary books in neurodiversity. And I just want to highlight Oliver Sacks. Although Oliver Sacks, the neurologist and essayist, has not specifically addressed neurodiversity, he's what I'd call the godfather of neurodiversity, because his books, including The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and An Anthropologist on Mars and other books like that, really embrace the complexity, the richness, the diversity, both the challenges and the advantages of individuals who have specific difficulties or specific injury in different areas of the brain. Finally, for ways to get in touch with me, you can visit my website, which is instituteforlearning.com, the number 4. My blog address is there. You can email me at thomas@instituteforlearning.com, and I tell you what I love. I'm compiling a database on the strengths of kids with special needs. So if you have any great stories about kids that you've worked with special needs, either in the regular classroom or in a special ed classroom, that talk about their strengths and how you were able to use their strengths to help them learn better, I'd love to hear from you. I'd like to create this database and do some research with that and eventually publish a paper on it. If you want to catch my channel on YouTube, you have that information as well. And now I'll thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to Carolyn, and we can have some comments, questions, and answers.
Yes, if anyone has questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the questions pane. The handout was, the link to the handout and the certificate are in a couple of places. One, if you look on your dashboard and you see a chat box, I put the links in there, and it's also in the email that you received with the information on how to access this webinar, and it'll also be listed in the follow-up email after the webinar is over. Okay, we have a question. How do you suggest we do this in the real world of accountability, test scores, and school?
Well, we can use that question to deal with, that question can be used to address any kind of educational reform. And essentially, I've given you all sorts of different strategies, many of which work perfectly well for helping kids with the Common Core standards. In fact, in my book, I've taken a specific Common Core standard for each disability label, and I've shown you how you can take these 7 components and essentially plug them into that particular skill or component. Just to give you an example, I mentioned Dragon Naturally Speaking. Now, if that helps some kids become more productive in their writing ability, this is going to help them meet that writing standard, that writing accountability set of standards that are there in the Common Core curriculum. So, I can't, these strategies are all quite different from each other, and I can't say that, A is going to be best in the, Common Core curriculum, and B, well, that's not going to work at all. I think all of these strategies can be modified so that you can work with them given the particular environment that you're in. And if you make your kids more successful, if you give them a more positive attitude, if you use their strengths to help them learn more effectively, won't that help them on their standardized tests? Won't that help them become more accountable on these Common Core standards?
Okay. What specific sports athletic strategies have you found to be most effective to build on the strengths of special education students?
Well, I can talk, for example, about martial arts, which has in studies been seen as an excellent approach for kids with ADD, ADHD, because it teaches self-discipline, it teaches focus, it teaches respect for one's opponent, it teaches a lot of things that kids with ADD, ADHD need to develop. Another research study suggested that sports for kids with ADD, ADHD are better carried out as individual sports rather than competitive sports. So they're going to be better off maybe doing swimming or gymnastics than soccer, which involves, a lot of interaction. Same may be true for kids with autism as well. I'm more familiar with the ADD, ADHD issue because I wrote a couple of books on it, but I think that you would find, exercise in general to be important for all of these disability categories, because exercise, we're discovering, John Brady wrote a wonderful book about this and others, exercise has an incredible impact on growing brain cells, on developing the brain, on making a healthy brain. And that can only help kids in their learning and their behaving in the classroom.
Okay. How do you influence other teachers and parents to have a different view of these kids?
Well, I go about doing workshops and seminars and
well, I think she means like how do you, if as an individual teacher, how can she influence parents and her colleagues?
I think one practical step you could do would be to take this 156-item strengths checklist and give it to your parents or your other teachers and tell them to fill it out and find out as much as they can or recall as much as they can about what they know about the student's strengths. Because that's the starting point in my mind. If you don't have time for anything else, find out as much as you can about their strengths and then communicate your knowledge of those strengths to the student. I've got some different exercises in the book about how you can celebrate strengths in the classroom with your students and diversities, and also how to conduct IEP meetings using an approach called appreciative inquiry, which is based upon starting the meeting with strengths, hopes, interests, and needs, and putting the emphasis on that. And the research has suggested that when you do that, you come up with more solutions and better IEPs and longer IEPs, i.e. better IEPs, than you would otherwise.
Okay. We have someone attending from New Zealand, and she wants to know if you've had experience using predictive writing software, for example, Word Q3, with students with high-functioning autism.
No, I haven't.
Okay. We have another question about the checklist that you mentioned. Where can folks find that?
It's in my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom,
Okay.
ASCD's book, which they just published.
All right. In your work on looking at neurodiversity, do you think we should change the labels like learning disabled that we give children?
Yes, I do. I really feel strongly about that. I think we should talk about the learning different child. I think we should try other approaches, intellectual diversities instead of intellectual disabilities. I think we ought to be creative with that. And it's not just me that's saying that. The former head of special education for the Department of Education at the federal level is now a professor at Harvard University, Tom Heir, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, H-E-H-I-R, and he describes himself, he's officially designated as a professor of learning differences. And I think, he's in the vanguard. There's a district in Colorado, Jefferson County District, that has a Department of Diversity and Inclusion. And these are positive signs. I think that if we see more of this kind of thing happening around the country, we're going to see that we're making a difference in kids' lives.
Okay. And final question, but before I get to the final question, if people want to get in touch with you with follow-up, they can contact you through your website and email and Twitter account. That's okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I would love to hear from them.
All right. So the final question was, can you briefly discuss how the strength-based strategies benefit not only children regarded as having disabilities, but also other learners in the classroom as well?
Right. Well, that's a very good question because, this is, in a sense, a universal design for learning methodology. If you put the emphasis on kids' strengths, you're not only doing this, for the kids with special needs, but you're helping all kids. If you teach curriculum units on people who have overcome adversity with disability labels, and you honor diversity in that way, you're sending an important message to all kids about the importance of honoring diversity, about the importance of using your strengths to succeed in life. And there's certainly a lot out there in the workplace now, books with titles like Discover Your Strengths and Strength Finder and Strength Builder and so forth, suggesting that, if you want to succeed in the workplace, and we're talking